This is Live from Lodi Garden, a special podcast series of Global Order where we delve deeper into conversations about world affairs. Sitting in this 15th century garden at the heart of New Delhi, the capital of India, I am your host, Ayushi Sharma. Today, I'm speaking to Sunaina Kumar, a celebrated researcher in the field of gender and development. Sunaina has been a journalist for more than a decade, and now she's a senior fellow at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy of the Observer Research Foundation. And at the time of recording this podcast, International Women's Day is just around the corner. So it is a very fitting occasion to talk to Sunaina about her work in the space of gender, development, diplomacy, and multilateralism. So, welcome, Sunaina. Thank you for sitting with me here.
Hi, Ayushi. Thanks so much for inviting me. It actually is such a pleasure to be here on a spring day in Delhi at Lodi Garden. So, it's the right space for us to be having this conversation. Also, the right timing, as you said, it's Women's Day tomorrow. So, a lot of things that we talk about through the year get a bump up and are just more getting more attention from people at this time. So that's a good thing.
That's why I wanted to sit with you. And when I was, reading about your work, I was quite fascinated to, consistently read about these three words, which were gender, diplomacy, and economics. And it got me thinking that you are working at the intersection of these three very, very, specific disciplines. I want to know, how did you come about, understanding gender approaches in diplomacy space and economic space, and how did that come about?
Sure. So let's begin with gender, and actually first want to just talk about what I was thinking when I was driving here to Lodi Garden, and just the fact that the place where we're recording this is a space that represents a sanctuary for women in the city, right? It's a space that women can come to and sit in and feel free. And it's quite interesting to think about that. It's a medieval garden, and gardens and parks have always been spaces of freedom for women. This is something that this historian Swapna Little from Delhi talks a lot about. The fact that a lot of gardens in Delhi were actually commissioned by women in Mughal courts. So if we think about Roshanara Bagh, Jahanara Bagh, many such gardens in this city of parks and gardens. So, I think the fact that it represents freedom. And to tie it in with your question really about economics and diplomacy, economics especially, but I'm not a trained economist at all. I've had like a sort of journey where I've been a journalist, working on the field, working on issues of development. And I think the interest in economics is more of what it means for a woman to be participating in the economy in a country like India. And I think that essential conundrum that we find constantly, the fact that even as women's literacy has grown in this country, it does not reflect in workforce participation. But the fact is that if we have to move or shift any social norms in this country, they don't shift on their own. They're very stubborn. And the only way that they do shift is when women find a level of financial autonomy, which then leads to just increased decision making. And that just leads to women themselves becoming agents of change.
Right. And, one of the things that resonated with me is also something that I think about, the fact that we have these kinds of conversations again and again about gender, about women's participation in the public spaces, especially in a country like ours. And there still is, it doesn't really translate, as you said, to workforce participation. What could be the reasons, according to you, that even after all these years of, active involvement of policymakers, of researchers, activists about women's rights and women's inclusions in the public spaces, but it still doesn't translate into workforce participation? Why do you think that is?
I think a very basic answer that sometimes we overlook because it's right in front of us is what happens in households themselves and in families, right? And then that widens to communities, society, economy. Within households, the sort of work burden that women carry. And I have been thinking about it a lot because the new time use survey, which the Ministry of Statistics and Planning Programming brings out, is just out. And it's been coming out every 5 years. So the last survey that we had was in 2019, and the results of the 2024 survey are out. And that survey brings out what we also know, but it's sometimes really good to have the data and the evidence right in front of our eyes. And it shows us that Indian women spend a really high amount of their time doing domestic and care work at home. A majority of that time is spent on cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, taking care of the elderly. Now, this is something which is, of course, also a global phenomena. So, depending on the context, whether it is Asian countries or Western countries, of course, women carry more of that. And this, again, it was visibilized more after COVID. But just the numbers tell us that it is higher for India. I actually did a study in the context of G20 economies, and we found that compared to men, women do 8.5 times more work at home. And that leads to a phenomena which is faced by all women worldwide, but much more by Indian women. And that is time poverty, right? So when you do not have any time, then that time cannot go into paid work, it cannot go into leisure, it cannot go into learning, it cannot go into well-being of women. So it's this whole sort of spiraling phenomenon. And of course, all the other G20 countries, Japan, Korea, had something like 3 or 4 times more. And then there are countries like Canada, which have like 1.5 times more. So, that is, I think, one of the primary reasons. And of course, then there are other things that we constantly talk about which inhibit women. Things like the fact that mobility and safety is a big factor that comes in rural and in urban areas. So there are, there are all these barriers that women face all of the time. But I think we really need to address those. The government and policymakers try to address those, but it's one of those wicked problems, difficult to solve.
I think it's one of those problems that need very, on-ground solutions which involve literally every strata of the society, and it would not just happen through a top-down approach to policymakers, I think. That's interesting. And I want to take this conversation more towards multilateralism and diplomacy. It's also something that I am interested in, and also something that I saw your work reflect a little bit, where I read one of your articles which considered women, how women can, transform multilateralism, how women can save multilateralism per se. What do you think about how did you go from considering women's spaces and researching on women's participation within India and in our social community, which is vastly different from when we consider the broader aspect of the international society and multilateral institutions per se. So how do you think women can save multilateralism, if I have to cut it short?
Okay, so the first part, that how are the two connected? I think it's connected because of the work that I am doing at my think tank, which is around the fact that we look a lot at what the global south approaches are, right? And this whole idea of cooperation between developing countries. So the center that I work in, which is called the Center for New Economic Diplomacy, was a center that was founded very much with the idea of countries from the global south, whether in Africa, Asia, just coming together because of shared challenges and shared experiences. So, and finding solutions. And again, this is something that we saw a lot under India's G20 presidency. That comes up for me because I worked very closely on the G20 presidency and at Think 20. And doing a lot of research on that. But, and I think, which is why this whole idea of what is the role of gender in international cooperation, in international relations, is something that we need to look at, because even if we at a time, first of all, when, and I know you're interested in multilateralism, but multilateralism itself is going through very challenging times.
Agreed.
Right? There's an entire sort of assault on multilateralism. Some of it, of course, there's context for it. This whole sort of backlash against globalization that we're seeing. There's less trust in institutions, and especially in multilateral institutions. Is one. But also multilateralism delivers, and it delivers on development. We do have a century of multilateralism now to look at how it can be reformed, what has worked, what has not worked. So even when we look at gender, I think some of the more important treaties for cooperation which have actually delivered results at country levels, right? From Sustainable Development Goals to Beijing Platform for Action to the CEDAW Convention, all of those are a result of multilateral action. So countries coming together at multilateral institutions, most often the United Nations also, but pledging and then working towards certain goals. So I think that we cannot dispense with multilateralism, but we also need to talk about how multilateralism actually is really a product of the last century. At a time when there was a group of men from the global north who controlled global governance and global decision making. And that has not really changed. So the piece that you are referring to, and it was interesting for me to really, again, scan the data, see what we find. And there were some really sort of interesting things that came up. For example, multilateral development banks. The big ones have never been headed by a woman at all. And there was another sort of data, and data really sticks in my head for some reason, because I feel like, that tells us the story. So I think out of all the big multilateral institutions that have been around after the Second World War, women have been in charge for 12% of the time. But the thing is that how do we then look at a system that is quite necessary, but also look at the fact that we're going through so much of churn in the world, from climate change to increasing conflicts to rising inequality. And I think that just making multilateralism not just more inclusive, not just with more women, but also bringing in reform, progressive ideas would make it fit for purpose for this century.
Agreed. But that sort of brings me to another aspect of, policy making and reforms. When we consider on-ground implementation, I quite often find that there is sort of a discrepancy between what we consider as there is a need for reform, and policies are made based on those needs, but it still sort of creates a discrepancy on how that is implemented and how, again, what the data shows us. Why do you think that discrepancy exists? Because we did touch upon, specifically in the case of India, where there is a vast social underpinning to how women's roles within the households and outside it are reflected. But why does this discrepancy still exist when we also know that, these kinds of policies also do exist?
I think that we do not have more women in decision making and leadership. And that's across all sectors and industries. And, even, so we were talking about multilateralism. or the fact that women are underrepresented in decision making. But that's not just true for the international system, it is true for national governments, it is true for subnational governments, and it's true for India, and it's true for the rest of the world. So, one stream of work that I looked at last year was related to the fact that we are going to be bringing in the Women's Reservation Bill, right? That
Right.
the from 2023, and the fact that after delimitation we will reserve 1/3 of seats for women, and based on that, how prepared are we to bring in such a sweeping change? Do we have women who would be able to step up to these roles of governance? And what have we got right and what have we not got right so far? So a starting point for that was really looking at the fact that for 3 decades now, we've had gender quotas in this country in governance at local levels, at panchayats and municipal corporations. And with those, again, I think it's a mixed picture that emerges. We find that that definitely we've done really well. We're one of the countries that has among the highest representation of women in local governments, about 40% or so on an average. So we've done very well on the representation part. But when it comes to meaningful participation, it's again a more mixed picture. I'm sure there are shows on it, that the very popular TV show called Panchayat that we all saw. And again, it's been in the news. There's a parliamentary committee which is debating this whole issue of proxy candidates, or, just that women come in on the quotas. But, what I found in my research was that, yes, of course, undeniably proxy candidates is a widespread phenomena, but it's not the only story that comes. So there are 2 other things that really come up. One is that when women step up, let's say, to power, they're facing the sort of barriers and obstructions in political participation that male counterparts are not facing. They have little or no exposure to public life. There's so much restriction on their mobility, stepping out of homes, participating in public life. So that just makes them less trained to be in governance. So the lack of training, the fact that spaces are so patriarchal, from political parties to government functionaries, that these women who are elected in panchayat or municipal corporations end up interacting with, to the fact that women candidates really struggle with fundraising, and running in politics is really about raising funds. So all of those, and I think another thing that I found in this research was that despite all these barriers, we know the challenges. We really have some interesting stories across the country of women making a difference, of women learning on the job, of stepping up and really doing some brilliant work on sustainable development, on water, on schools, on road and infrastructure, on things that really matter to the community. So I think if we can use some of those and take it up to those levels from those learnings, as the country prepares for this, will be interesting.
Right. Do you have any such stories that you would share with us? Anyone that you, through the course of your research, thought that, okay, this story has not gotten, much traction, or many people don't know about it, but this is one story that sort of reflects the change on the ground that has been happening?
So there would be one, and it could be something that's echoed across the country. I think what I found really interesting was that this whole idea of collectivization of women that happens with women's collectives, with self-help groups, and with cooperatives, right? So a lot of them are very much based on the idea of bringing women together under savings groups. So you can have maybe a group of 10 women together, and that becomes a self-help group. Or you have larger cooperatives across the country. They work on agriculture, they work on all of these livelihood-based options. And it is, how the very fact that you will sometimes meet women who have stepped out of their homes just for the very first time, and what it does to them when first find this peer group of other women, and they could just be women in their village, and how they start, how small steps towards financial empowerment also makes them socially empowered and politically empowered. So I actually met so many spoken with over the years of women who've had this journey, right? Who started from the very base and then ended up being leaders of their self-help groups. And then self-help groups, then like groups of 10 can then turn into federations in over a district, right? And that can be being a leader of 100 women. And then that grows and grows and grows. And some of them then have these journeys that it is because then they have all these women around them who will also rally behind them that they ended up in Gram Panchayats. And from there on, their ambition only grows.
Right. Yeah. I think, self-help groups are perhaps the most significant examples of these collective actions that women themselves, just take.
It definitely has required a lot of policy push.
Agreed.
On the part of the national government, of state governments, of civil society groups who step in, work with women. But of course, it's also the women.
Yeah.
But I think the takeaway is that it doesn't take one, it takes many. And in countries and contexts like India or similar contexts of countries in Asia or in Africa, I think this has been such a road to empowerment.
Agreed. Yeah. So we were talking about the Panchayati Raj system, and if I'm not wrong, very recently, one of the UN reports also lauded India's Panchayati Raj system as perhaps one of the most significant examples of women's participation and at the structural level and at the policy level. So I want to ask you, and we are now working towards reservation for women in the parliament as well, but do you think that this structure can be amplified to the national level and be implemented in that way? And as you said, that we did touch upon the fact that whether women are ready, if there's a need, there is this need for skill building and capacity building for women leaders as well. But at this moment, where we are now, do you think that this kind of a structure can be amplified to the national level?
I think for that to happen, I definitely think it could be. I think that we have very strong leadership, female leadership at the grassroots level, which has been created over the last 30 years. And but there are certain gaps, and those gaps will need to be filled. When it comes to legislative assemblies, to parliament, I think there will again be the questions of how do you fundraise, where do you find, which is also why we find, and especially this is true for all first-time politicians, but especially true for females, that they do come from political families. And, will they be able to, and then how do we get past those stumbling blocks? How do we involve maybe more of the private sector, more of civil society groups for capacity training? I think this remains to be seen. So I mean, what I see is that it's a little difficult to predict how this will pan out over the next few years as we bring in the reservations.
Right. Coming back to workforce and education. Actually, education is one sector I wanted to touch upon, because we do talk about workforce participation and we do talk about women's leadership. I think education sector is one where we can, implement those skill building and policy making, aspects of it. How do you think the education sector is faring in terms of women's participation in India at this moment?
I think the one thing that has happened, and I'm not talking about growing literacy levels for women, that's sort of, we know that. But the fact is that, and this is true for men as well, but it's especially true for women, that a majority of women work in the informal workforce under very precarious conditions, without any social security. So, how do we skill women to ensure that they can move more towards formal jobs? And that's where the education sector, but especially skilling, comes in. And of course, we've had a big policy making push with the National Skill Mission, but has that really translated into change on the ground? I don't think we can say that that has been substantial. The scale of the problem is huge. Of course, we have a lot of these programs for skilling. And a lot of them have a very sort of gender lens to it also, so that they have sort of reserved seats for women under skilling programs. But I think another thing that happens is that we're still looking at skilling, and I'm talking about skilling here. I know your question was education, but I feel like skilling becomes the bridge between education and workforce participation. So again, the focus of skilling has been so much on traditional livelihoods that we still will run skilling centers in the country, and they will skill women to work as beauticians, in tailoring, and that is okay actually, because a lot of women do want to work in those sectors. But then a lot of women do not want to work in those sectors and could be better paid if they were to take up non-traditional livelihoods, be skilled for those. But we find that, that shift in thinking has not quite happened.
Right. You did talk about the unorganized sector, which is a big part of, women's participation just generally. Do you think regulating the unorganized sector would contribute somehow to skill building for women and then translating those skills into just security of employment somehow? I'm just thinking out loud because the unorganized sector remains very unregulated, which is why it sort of creates space for exploitation of women's labor and their skills as well. So do you think regulating that sector and implementing labor laws for the unorganized sector could also be an answer to something like this?
So the government is trying to do that with the gig economy, for example. Right. And the gig economy is interesting because it has become, at least in urban India, it is just leading to increased participation by women, right? And it is a major source of employment. So the gig economy so far was unregulated, and as it is really a new sort of new way of work, mediated mostly by technology. And there has been attempt to regulate it, to bring in some aspects of social security in the gig economy. But again, it remains to be seen how those will be implemented.
Agreed. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about a lot of aspects of gender and women's participation and their, how women are seen in the policy space, in the leadership space. But I want to ask you that there is, of course, this social aspect of gender inequality that still exists in the Indian society, pertaining to just the Indian society, and we have touched upon this aspect a lot. Gender inequality is such a phenomenon that we have been dealing with since, I don't know, just it feels like the beginning of time.
Right, it does.
It does. But I want to ask your perspective on it. How do we tackle, because this is something that we deal with day to day, whichever field we are in. And it's such a mammoth issue that us two women sitting on it, having a conversation, it feels nice. It feels like we're being heard and we're talking about these issues. But for this to be actually a conversation translating into something very substantial, How do you think that can happen? And
I absolutely agree with this. And I mean, I think you're asking how do we shift the needle on what is really a difficult subject to shift the needle on. I'll just have to go back, and maybe I have a bit of a bias here, but I do turn back to women and work, women participating in the economy, women finding autonomy through that. I mean, it has been my area of research, but I also feel that that is, that for anything to change, the answer somewhere. It's. I'm not saying that it is the only solution. Of course, it isn't. When we talk about gender, we're talking about so many problems. We're talking about gender-based violence. We're talking about a whole gamut. But this, I think, is something that, and here I think the role of policy making, because if we look at a problem, we also have to look at solutions. And this, at least, and of course, there's also a big debate around this, where a lot of it's called the World Bank model, where we talk about, if women are participating in the economy, it's actually great for economies and for countries. And a lot of women actually sit in question that, it's women need to be participating in the economy for their own selves. It's not just about economic good, but I think that argument also works because it's an argument that can be sold to governments, to international organizations. So there's a reason why that argument sustains. So I'm not entirely against the smart economics model for women and economic participation. So I think it does go to that, because it also gives us room to then look at solutions. For example, there has been this whole drive for digital financial inclusion in the country, right? And that has had a very strong element of also addressing the gender aspect of it. Even the budget this year, which lays out this bold vision for 4 groups of people, right? So that's the farmer, the poor, the youth, and the women. And like one of the targets is 70% participation by 2047. That's a very high goal. I would love to see it happen. But I think that it's, we cannot be making change within families, at least as people who work on policy, but we can look at how supportive policies can bring in this change.
Yeah. And the budget, actually, I wanted to touch upon, but I think you did point this out, that there is a specific focus on women's participation in the budget, and we'll see how this pans out. But anything that you would like to say about this year's budget that resonates with you as a researcher?
So a couple of things. I think that there are some bright spots. They announced a scheme for first-time entrepreneurs, which is focused very much on women and ensuring that women have access to credit, which of course is a big barrier that women face while setting up businesses. I think another part which will connect with the first-time entrepreneur scheme is this whole transformation that they're looking at for India Post to become a logistical hub and to become a hub for financial payments and payment systems. And that again is connected because it will be able to reach the underserved, the last mile delivery in rural areas. And again, it's a scheme that does target women, first-time entrepreneurs. So I think some of those are interesting and could be transformational. Could the budget have done more? For sure, it could have done more. I think we've had gender budgeting in India now for 20 years. And at this year's gender budget went up marginally, and that's a good sign. But it's still below what the UN prescribes. UN prescribes 5% of GDP. I think we're at some 1.2% still. And there are parts of it. I mean, because gender is so all encompassing. We're looking at health, we're looking at education. Under health, for example, the ASHA workers, who really are the backbone of the National Health Mission, still do not get fair wages, right? They get honorariums. And we really rely on them and the work that they do. There was scope to have done more, even towards addressing questions of mobility, safe public infrastructure for women to travel in. But yes, I think it's a good start.
It's a good start. But of course, a lot remains to be done. And you did point out a very good point regarding the wages discrepancy and the gap that exists over there. And this has been a conversation, I think, since a long time about the pay gap that exists between women workers and the men workers. Why do you think that sort of still exists? And I understand that there is we're not allocating as much resources towards women's participation as is prescribed, but do you think that could be a reason why this kind of a discrepancy exists? Are there social reasons behind that? And I think there are, but what's our assessment of it?
I think two parts. First of all, the pay gap is global, right? It's a global phenomena, and the I mean, actually a few parts, and of course it does come back to social norms. The fact is that not only are there unconscious biases that women workers might face, but also the fact that women often will not have access to the same levels of education and skilling that men might have, that gives men an edge in the labor market. That's one. And the third, of course, is, again, we go back to the fact that a lot of female workers often have to take gaps in their work, what is often called the sort of motherhood penalty, and the fact that sometimes they have to take breaks, rejoin work. I think all of those accrue to lead to this.
I think a lot has to be done to get over that bias, because I agree that a lot of it has to do with just women's physiology, the biology of it, and the fact that you said the motherhood leave. I think paternal leaves are also now becoming a thing,
they are,
which
yes.
I think is a good start to it.
Absolutely. We're talking more and more about it. There's advocacy around it. It comes up. The government is talking about it. The Indian government is. So those are good signs.
Those are good signs. So, as we come to the end of this conversation, I just want to ask you a very pertinent question that I think we just need to address it. The fact that you are working in the gender space since so long, why do you think that we need a gendered lens to just analyze every aspect of our life, in the sense that we did talk about a lot of the gaps that exist, inequality and women's participation, the need for the participation and all of that, but this kind of a critical gendered lens that we need to assess and analyze every aspect of not just the professional life, not just the policies of the country, but also our personal lives that we lead. Why do you think this gender lens is important for not just us women, but for every other identity?
Wow, that's almost an existential question. I'd love to get your opinion on this. But I would say I think it's necessary because we have to differentiate women's experiences from men's experiences, whether it is in every part of society, everything that we've talked about over the last few minutes, whether it is politics, within families, at work, in societies, communities, in countries. and in the international system. I think we've trekked across everything in this conversation, and it is to understand that their experiences and the obstacles or the barriers that women end up facing are not just high, but they really often don't exist for men. And that is why I think even something like budget, which we were talking about, we constantly need a gendered lens to address this. And it's also interesting that we're talking about all this at a time when there's actually a backlash against inclusivity, DEI, and gender equality in the world, and also with the Trump administration, of course. And I think the more that we see of this backlash, the more that we see of this resistance, we need more of this.
Yeah, we do need more of these conversations. And I thank you for sitting down with me. It's quite sunny now.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed our conversation. And thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you, Ayushi. I have enjoyed this conversation very much. I've also enjoyed having a gendered lens while sitting at Lodi Garden.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.